On a gray morning in late February 2025, the line at the grain elevator outside Terre Haute formed exactly the way it always did, with newer trucks up front and older steel waiting farther back, and Earl Coleman parked last in a 1997 Ford F-150 that rattled at idle and showed 312,000 miles on a sun-faded cluster. Rust had eaten through the rocker panels in jagged strips. Primer spotted both rear fenders. His overalls were clean but worn thin, with careful stitching at both knees and one patch at the right pocket, where a screwdriver had torn through years earlier. The man stepping down from a polished diesel pickup 2 spaces ahead, Travis Keene of Meridian Ridge Development, wore a pressed field jacket with a stitched company logo, square-toe boots still glossy from the dealer floor, and a watch that flashed when he checked his phone. He glanced once at Earl, once at the truck, and made the same mistake half the county had made for 2 decades. Everyone knew Earl's house sat under a patched tin roof he had repaired himself for $1,840 in materials and 2 weekends on a ladder. Everyone knew he still bought work gloves in 3-packs at farm supply clearance and drove 10 extra miles for cheaper fuel when the spread hit 15 cents a gallon. What almost nobody tracked was the ledger he updated every Sunday night at his kitchen table, in pencil first and then in ink when numbers cleared. That ledger showed 40 acres purchased in 1988 for $48,000 cash, 60 acres added in 1996 for $72,600 cash, 120 acres bought at sheriff's sale in 2009 for $294,000 cash, while bidders with financing contingencies waited for approvals that never arrived. By 2024, he owned 640 acres and leased 220 at $265 per acre. Corn, soybeans, hay, and a small cattle line. Average annual net over the previous 5 years, $312,000. Interest expense, $0. Long-term debt, $0. Annual household spending, including insurance, utilities, groceries, church giving, medical out-of-pocket, and truck maintenance, $24,300. He looked tired. He was not broke. Those are different conditions. Earl was not born with land. In 1986, at age 24, he had $11,700 saved from custom baling, fence work, and winter shifts at a feed mill, and he had one clear memory burned deep enough to function like law. He had watched his neighbor, Glenn Carver, lose 180 acres at auction during the rate spike years. Glenn had borrowed variable. Prime moved, payments doubled. Good yields could not outrun bad terms. Earl remembered the sound of bids landing like dropped tools while Glenn stood with his cap in both hands and no words left. No villains in that memory, only arithmetic and timing. By October 1987, Earl had written on the inside cover of his first ledger, "No borrowed money for anything that depreciates, no variable rate, ever. Land only when cash covers purchase and 1 bad year after." He started small and unglamorous. In spring 1988, he rented 70 acres from a retired school bus mechanic at $82 per acre, raised soybeans at 41 bushels average, sold at $6.12, grossed $17,564, and netted $5,980 after seed, fuel, fertilizer, repairs, and rent. He did not celebrate. He rolled the net into a money market at 7.4% and kept driving the same truck he bought, used for $3,900. In 1989, he farmed 95 rented acres and netted $8,420. In 1990, 110 acres and $11,030 net. In 1991, drought trimmed yields, and he still finished positive because he had no machinery payment and no interest meter running while he slept. By the second week of November 1988, he had enough to make his first move that looked conservative to everyone else and radical only in hindsight. A widow on South County Road needed to sell 40 acres quickly to settle estate costs. Asking price was $51,000. Earl offered $48,000 cash and a 10-day close. She accepted because certainty had value. He moved into the farmhouse already on that parcel, the same house with the tin roof he still patched by hand. Property tax was $1,260 that year. Insurance was $640. He cut his own firewood to lower winter heating bills and kept precise utility logs, not out of fixation, but because small leaks become big outcomes over 38 years. He did not reject all borrowing because he feared risk. He rejected payments that removed options. That distinction mattered when machinery salesmen started making the rounds in the mid-1990s. One offered a package with a combine, planter, and guidance unit, total financed cost $286,400, 7-year note at 8.2%, monthly payment $4,470. Earl priced the same capability in older iron plus repairs. A used combine for $26,500, a 12-row planter for $9,800, and a winter parts budget of $6,200. Total $42,500 cash plus labor. He calculated annual payment savings at $53,640 and wrote one line in his ledger margin: "Banks do not fix bearings at midnight. I do." In 1996, he bought 60 more acres for $72,600 cash after two brothers settled an inheritance. In 2001, he added a grain bin setup for $38,900 paid in 2 checks over 11 months, then captured basis improvement averaging 23 cents per bushel by timing sales better. On 70,000 annual bushels moved through storage, that basis spread alone added about $16,100 gross in a normal year. Not dramatic. Compounding is rarely dramatic while it is happening. The sheriff's sale in 2009 proved the method under stress. Credit was tight. Banks were slow. A 120-acre tract with good drainage and road access came to auction with opening bid at $280,000. Earl sat in the back in a faded coat and mud-caked boots. 2 men in clean vests discussed his jacket before bidding started and assumed he was there for free coffee. Final hammer: $294,000. Earl handed over a cashiered check before lunch. One of those men later admitted he had pre-qualified for $360,000, but did not have liquid funds when timing mattered. Earl planted soybeans on that parcel the next spring and never mentioned the scene again. By 2014, he had settled into a rhythm that looked plain from the road and rigorous on paper. He tracked cost per acre by field, not by farm average, and he tracked fuel by task, not by month. Corn seed, fertilizer, crop protection, machinery depreciation, and labor were entered per acre and compared against 3-year yield averages. If a field missed target twice, he changed practice or input rate. If an implement failed twice in season, he rebuilt or replaced with used, cash only. Household costs stayed flat while peers upgraded homes and trucks. Earl cooked at home, wore repaired clothes, and set annual personal spending caps that rose only with medical inflation and property tax changes. A ledger stretch from 2018 through 2024 explained why his old truck survived and his balance sheet strengthened. 2018. 610 owned acres, 200 leased, net farm income, $287,400, lease expense $53,000, interest $0, end year cash, an equivalence $1,180,000. 2019. Heavy spring delays, net $241,900, no operating loan, deferred one machinery purchase, end year liquidity $1,302,000. 2020. Strong soybean year, net $349,600, prepaid fertilizer discount captured at 4.5%, end year liquidity $1,594,000. 2021. Input inflation begins, net $318,200, diesel hedge through fixed supplier contract saved 41 cents per gallon on 14,000 gallons. End year liquidity $1,812,000. 2022. Added leased acreage at $265 per acre. Net $331,500 after rents. No term debt. End year liquidity $1,996,000. 2023. Weather volatility. Net $301,100. Dryland management gains held yields above county trend. End year liquidity $2,062,000. 2024. Net $323,300. Household spending $24,300. Charitable giving $36,000. End year liquidity $2,140,000. In March 2025, when Travis Keene first drove down Earl's Lane and called $2 million for 200 roadside acres retirement money, he expected emotion, pride, maybe fear. Earl poured coffee into 2 plain mugs and listened without interruption. Travis spoke in polished urgency about volatility, aging operators, and timing windows that close fast. Earl nodded once, then stood, walked to the counter, and returned with a folder 12 years thick. University Extension Soil Tests. Organic matter rising from 2.1% to 4.3%. Phosphorus steady at 38 parts per million. Potassium at 182. Infiltration rates improved enough to reduce drought year corn losses by roughly 18 bushels per acre, compared with nearby conventionally worked ground. Earl set the papers between them and spoke in the same tone he used for feed ores. Those 200 acres average 196 bushels corn and 61 soybeans. At conservative prices and current costs, net is about $184,000 a year. Your offer is 10.9 times earnings on debt-free ground. Travis looked at the truck again on his way out as if it should have changed the calculation. It did not. By the time Travis reached the lane, he had already picked up his phone, and 2 turns later, he was telling someone at Meridian that the farmer in patched overalls had attachment issues and would come around when pressure built. Earl watched the new diesel pickup shrink past the windbreak, then turned back to the sink, rinsed both mugs, and set the soil folder flat on the counter, like it belonged there more than any sale contract ever could. 30 minutes later, he drove to the elevator in the same 1997 Ford, with the same rattle and the same rust, and the same quick judgments rose around him. A younger merchandiser in a clean quarter-zip asked if he wanted to forward price only half his bushels to stay safe this year, speaking slowly, as if explaining risk to a man who had not met it before. Earl answered in 7 words. Price half now. Watch basis. Hold cash. Then he handed over settlement sheets totaling $418,640 in grain receipts from the previous season and asked for wire timing on two prepaid input invoices worth $96,300. The merchandiser blinked once and stopped using the slow voice. At the coffee table near the scale office, Travis stood with two county board regulars and a lender from town, polished boots still clean despite the slush. He laid out his case with practiced confidence, the way people do when they are used to being the only ones with numbers in a room. Subdivision demand, traffic growth, a $2 million anchor parcel. One of the board regulars looked across at Earl's truck and said, not cruelly but carelessly, "That kind of offer retires a place like his." The lender nodded and added that most operators Earl's age were one equipment rollover away from the trouble, then mentioned current variable operating lines at 8.9%, as if this confirmed the point. Earl said nothing. He pulled his cap brim down, signed one feed pickup ticket for $3,740, and left with a pallet of mineral and salt blocks in the bed. The contrast sat in the open where everyone could see it. New chrome discussing leverage, old steel carrying paid-for inventory. The foundation of that silence had been poured decades earlier, and not through theory. In 1984, when Earl was 22 and still running nights at the feed mill, he watched Glenn Carver's auction from a distance near the gate, hands deep in his coat pockets, listening as bids erased a family map field by field. Glenn had borrowed against expected yields, then borrowed again against higher expected prices, and finally borrowed to service the first two notes when rates moved hard. A primary note at 9.2% had reset above 14.0. A machinery line at 11.5% floated higher. Gross farm receipts looked big on paper, but fixed payments climbed faster than the seasons could recover. Earl did the arithmetic on a paper sack that afternoon. If interest and principal demanded $87,000 a year before fuel, seed, and fertilizer, then one bad weather cycle could force liquidation even on productive ground. That memory stayed technical, not sentimental. Debt was not evil in his mind. It was inflexible. Weather was flexible in the worst direction. He built a personal framework from that lesson and tested it against real constraints. In 1986, he rented his first 55 acres at $79 per acre with one aging tractor and borrowed only a gravity wagon from a cousin for harvest week. The crop netted $4,260 after all direct costs, and instead of scaling immediately, he split the proceeds into 3 envelopes: land fund, repair fund, and tax reserve. He would later formalize the percentages at 60, 25, and 15. In 1987, he was offered a dealer package on a newer tractor with 6 years of payments. Down payment, $6,000. Annual note, $7,920. Insurance increase, $640. Expected downtime reduction, according to the sales pitch, worth about $2,000 per year. Earl penciled the numbers on his kitchen table and saw a non-trivial trade-off. He would gain convenience but surrender optionality. He kept the old machine, spent $1,140 on bearings, belts, and hydraulic hoses, and lost 3 Saturdays to labor. He also kept full control of his cash position going into spring. By 1988, when he bought those first 40 acres for $48,000 cash, he had one rule stronger than pride: never let a bank schedule outrank rainfall. The widow who sold him that parcel did not ask about his truck or his shirt sleeves. She asked whether he could close in 10 days and whether the check would clear without contingencies. It did. In 1990 and 1991, while neighboring operators expanded with term notes tied to optimistic commodity assumptions, Earl ran a narrower operation and stacked liquidity. He carried no recreational debt, no credit card balance, and no pickup payment. He repaired his own roof, stretched equipment life through winter teardown routines, and treated depreciation as a real expense rather than an accountant's formality. The resulting tension was obvious to everyone around him. He looked constrained. He was compounding. He crossed his first seven-figure net worth threshold quietly in 2013, largely because his cost structure stayed lean while land and retained earnings climbed together. The numbers were plain. 520 owned acres at an average assessed market value, near $6,900 per acre, implied $3,588,000 in land value. Liquid reserves sat at $824,000. Equipment, fully owned, carried a conservative resale estimate of $286,000. Grain inventory net of prepaid obligations added another $119,000. Total asset base, $4,817,000. Total long-term liabilities, $0. Deferred tax exposure existed, and he recorded it. But no lender could force a sale. That was the point. Wealth for Earl was not consumption capacity. It was decision autonomy under stress. Early discipline showed up most clearly in moments that looked boring from the road. In February 2016, he attended a consignment auction where a clean 2008 12-row planter sat between flashy late-model units, financed by dealers and discussed like status symbols. The new equivalent in town listed at $146,000 plus setup fees. Earl bought the used planter for $28,000 cash, paid $1,900 to haul it, then budgeted $4,300 for meter rebuilds and row unit wear parts. Total outlay $34,200. He documented expected service life at 9 seasons and straight-line depreciation at $3,800 per year. The financed new planter option, assuming 7.1% over 7 years with 10% down, would have cost roughly $24,900 annually, including interest and insurance differential. Savings in year 1 alone exceeded $20,000. Over 7 years, cash preserved approached $140,000 before considering investment return. He did not call that clever. He called it staying alive in bad cycles. The same method governed his home life. Annual household spending remained near $24,300, not because he romanticized scarcity, but because he saw how lifestyle drift converted temporary high prices into permanent obligations. Property taxes rose, so he trimmed discretionary purchases. Medical costs increased, so he shopped term policies and increased deductibles only where reserve funds could absorb risk. He and his sister, Lila Morton, who handled seasonal bookkeeping support 3 months each winter, reviewed every line item each January at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. Groceries averaged $6,480. Utilities $4,920. Insurance across home, liability, and health supplements $7,340. Truck upkeep and fuel not charged to farm books $2,180. Clothing and boots $620. Church and local giving $2,760. Total $24,300. Lila once asked whether he would ever replace the Ford. Earl answered, "When repair math loses." Through 2024, it had not. By late afternoon, the day Travis made his offer, Earl Earl was back in his machine shed with the right rear wheel off a grain cart and grease under both thumbnails, checking bearings he had already rebuilt twice. Deshaun Miller, then still piecing together acreage and helping evenings for extra income, stopped by to return a chain binder and found Earl, with parts laid out in careful rows on cardboard. New hub assembly quoted by dealer, $2,780. Earl's rebuild cost that day $412 in bearings and seals, plus 3 hours of labor. Deshaun asked why he still did this work himself when his operation had grown so far beyond survival mode. Earl set the torque wrench down and gave the longest answer he usually gave. Because every dollar that does not leave in panic can leave later on purpose. Deshaun did not reply right away. He just watched the old farmer wipe a housing clean, pack grease, and reassemble a working system from pieces others would have replaced on credit. At dusk, he sat again at the kitchen table, entered the day's numbers, and added a fresh page labeled Meridian Scenario. He listed offered sale price at $2 million. Estimated federal and state capital gains liability at approximately $380,000, given basis, allocation, and transaction costs. Net investable proceeds $1,620,000. At 5.2% annual return over 15 years. Future value near $3,464,000 before inflation adjustment. Then he listed hold scenario based on the latest rolling average operating net from the 200 acres, $184,000 annually, with conservative reinvestment assumptions and no land appreciation. Future value of retained earnings stream over the same period exceeded $4,100,000. Add probable appreciation on Class 1 and Class 2 soils, and the gap widened further. He underlined one line twice. Selling converts a compounding asset into a taxed lump sum. He closed the ledger, turned off the kitchen light, and left the soil tests on top where they would be first in hand when Travis came back. He slept 4 hours, woke at 4:40, and reopened the ledger before the first kettle whistle. The Meridian Scenario page stayed on top, but he turned backward through older books, not out of nostalgia, out of calibration. When pressure arrived, Earl trusted long sequences more than single-year spikes. By sunrise, he had copied 38 years onto one legal pad and marked the years where one decision altered 10 years of outcomes. The progression looked plain at first. It always did. In 1997, with 100 owned acres and 140 rented, gross farm receipts were $146,200, and net farm income was $39,480 after all direct costs and rents, with zero interest expense and year-end liquidity of $92,300. In 1998, corn prices softened and net fell to $31,900, but he added $14,000 to his land fund and $8,200 to tax reserves. In 1999, he sold 38 head of feeder cattle at an average of $612 and pushed net back to $44,700. In 2000, a wet spring and delayed planting cut yields, netting $28,100, and he still ended positive because no payment schedule demanded cash in June, when rain kept him parked. 3 days after that audit morning, he met his accountant, Dana Rusk, and handed over the pad with one request: stress test every assumption at lower commodity prices, not higher. Dana ran the same arithmetic with conservative bands. At $4.25 corn and $10.40 soybeans, Earl's system still cleared operating margins because machinery cost per acre remained low and fixed obligations remained almost non-existent. That was the hinge. In 2001, he spent $38,900 on grain storage, paid in 2 checks and captured an average basis gain of 23 cents per bushel on roughly 70,000 bushels, adding about $16,100 annual gross in normal years. In 2002, he netted $52,600 and left $41,000 in cash equivalents. In 2003, he bought 80 acres from a retiring dairyman for $132,000 cash, then closed the year with liquidity still above $140,000. In 2004, after inputs rose, he delayed replacing a grain cart, repaired the axle for $1,260, and finished with $57,300 net. In 2005, he prepaid fertilizer at an off-season discount of 3.8% and saved $6,740 on one purchase cycle. By 2006, owned acreage held at 180 and rented ground at 210, with net income at $88,900 and end-year liquidity at $286,000. The financial rhythm accelerated only because the discipline stayed boring. In 2007, he had the cash to buy a newer combine for $189,000 with financing, declined it, bought a used unit at auction for $47,500 cash, and spent $9,800 over 2 winters rebuilding wear items. Effective annualized machinery costs dropped by roughly $18,000 compared with financed replacement. In 2008, he carried higher fuel expense and still posted $73,200 net. Then came the 2009 sheriff sale, 120 acres at $294,000 cash, bringing owned acres to 300. Many operators saw that purchase as aggressive. On paper, it was the opposite. He bought during a liquidity drought when sellers needed certainty and finance bidders could not close on time. In 2010, he integrated that ground, rotated soybeans first, and netted $102,400 even with drainage repairs. From 2011 through 2017, he turned retained earnings into land in measured steps. In 2011, he purchased 70 acres for $238,000 cash from an estate that demanded a 30-day close. In 2012, he ran 370 owned and 220 leased acres, netting $164,300. In 2013, his first 7-figure net worth year, he maintained household spending under $22,000 and pushed liquidity toward $824,000. In 2014, he added 90 acres at $441,000 cash, taking owned ground to $460, then accepted lower short-term liquidity to avoid long-term debt. In 2015, he rebuilt an older tractor transmission for $6,300 instead of trading into a $96,000 financed replacement. In 2016, he bought the 2008 planter for $28,000 cash and budgeted $6,200 for setup and parts, still below 1/4 of new finance cost. In 2017, he acquired 110 acres at $792,000 cash after 2 siblings settled probate, and ended the year with $612,000 liquid because crop prices and basis timing both cooperated. By the second week of April 2025, that long ledger had turned into operating rules Dana could model against almost any commodity cycle. Earl's average machinery cost per acre across the previous decade was $74. Comparable financed operations in the county often ran $132 to $168. His average interest expense stayed at $0. His average annual household draw remained under $25,000 meaning retained earnings mostly stayed inside the farm ecosystem. The gap compounded quietly. Dana's projection showed that a yearly savings spread of even $58 per acre across 860 worked acres produced $49,880 per year before investment return. Reinvested at 5.2% over 15 years, that efficiency spread alone approached $1,089,000. No headline, just arithmetic. The contrast with peers was never about intelligence. It was about timing, terms, and how unforgiving variable debt became when weather and rates moved together. Ben Harlan farmed hard and well, and nobody doubted his work ethic. In 2022, after 2 strong seasons, he financed a $410,000 combine and a $190,000 planter at 7.25% variable on 7-year terms. Initial structure looked manageable on projected yields. $6,920 monthly, combined payments, plus higher insurance and service contracts that pushed true annual fixed machinery burden above $95,000. Then 2023 and 2024 both underperformed his planning case. Gross receipts fell, repair overlap hit anyway, and his lender reset terms upward. Ben did not miss because he was careless. He missed because thin margins could not carry fixed obligations that assumed better years. By February 2025, he surrendered 280 rented acres and kept only the core 190 he could operate with controlled costs. Rosa and Miguel Velez faced a different trap with the same structure underneath. They expanded hog capacity with 2 barns and a $1,260,000 note that started at 5.1% and later moved to 9.4%. At origination, their monthly obligation sat near $8,900. After reset and revised amortization pressure, effective monthly cash demand climbed above $12,700 before feed volatility, labor, utilities, and veterinary costs. Then feed costs spiked and stayed high. They worked every hour available, sold a truck, cut household spending, and still watched working capital evaporate. Their bankruptcy filing was not moral failure. It was a mismatch between variable debt and volatile inputs. Earl said that once, in private, and never repeated it as a lesson at their expense. Nathan Pike had inherited 160 acres, debt-free from his father, and still got cornered by operating debt decisions under market stress. In 2024, he carried grain on borrowed money, expecting a basis improvement that did not materialize. Instead, basis moved against him by roughly 62 cents per bushel on a large position, while interest on his operating line accrued near 8.8% annualized. Holding costs turned a manageable plan into forced sales. He refinanced twice, then could not bridge spring inputs and debt service simultaneously. The farm entered auction with a reserve nobody in his family wanted to test. Nathan stood through the sale and signed papers with steady hands. He later took a mechanic's job in Clay County and kept helping his daughter on weekends because land, even lost land, still held family meaning. Caleb Dunn made the 4th case everyone mentioned quietly. He leased aggressively at peak rents, added 2 new tractors financed at fixed rates that looked reasonable at signing, then took on short-term operating debt when fertilizer jumped 27% and fuel crossed $5.12 per gallon. His cost structure left no room for 2 average years, let alone 1 poor and 1 dry. He sold 1 tractor back at a loss, then exited row crops entirely, and shifted to custom application work. He was not mocked. In county meetings, people described him as what he was, a capable operator caught in stacked headwinds. Pressure from Meridian kept rising in parallel. Travis returned with a formal letter marked Final Window, framed as a professional courtesy, and set a response deadline that expired in 12 days. He also signed options on parcels north and east of Earl's boundary, enough to suggest momentum to county officials, even though corridor continuity still depended on Earl's roadside 200. At the same time, county reassessment notices landed in mailboxes across western Indiana. Earl's annual property tax moved from $38,400 to $52,900. That increase did not break him, but it tightened the same margins already stressed by input inflation. For leveraged operators, reassessment functioned like another rate hike layered onto existing obligations. Earl handled the squeeze exactly as his ledger predicted he should. He did not chase expansion. He did not panic sell grain. He updated break-even sheets field by field and moved prepaid purchases to discount windows where possible. He bought urea and potash in split tranches rather than one emotional order, reducing average purchase price by enough to save roughly $18 per acre on planned corn ground. He repaired instead of replacing where downtime risk stayed acceptable. He kept his older 1997 Ford on the road for another season because truck pride did not yield bushels. Most importantly, he preserved working capital. While others were sending first dollars each month to lenders, he still chose where first dollars went. By late June, the weather turned from inconvenient to threatening. Rain missed his side of the county in 3 consecutive systems. Topsoil cracked on lighter ground, and rolled corn leaves showed by mid-morning instead of late afternoon. Extension bulletins revised regional yield expectations downward. Forward markets reacted in the usual uneven way, offering hope in price while costs stayed stubborn. Earl called Dana twice that week, once to confirm cash coverage under a severe yield scenario, and once to model tax impact if he sold old inventory into strength. Both calls ended with the same result. He remained solvent and flexible because no long-term lender sat senior to weather. 7 days later, Ben called after dark and asked whether Earl would look at his machinery books with him. Earl drove over without comment and stayed until nearly midnight. Social pressure to take Meridian's offer intensified as the drought deepened. At the elevator, 2 men told Earl he was being stubborn, with retirement money on the table. At church, one neighbor asked if he was risking too much over sentiment. Earl answered with numbers when asked directly, and silence when the question was rhetorical. He told Lila one evening that selling productive, debt-free acres to solve a temporary stress cycle resembled eating seed corn. She nodded and updated the household sheet. Utilities were up. Insurance was up. Nothing else had to move. In the first week of July, county staff scheduled a drought field review with extension agronomists after conflicting claims surfaced in rezoning packets about what qualified as marginal ground. Travis had circulated language that treated Earl's roadside parcel as low strategic farm value compared with residential conversion. Earl printed 12 years of certified soil tests, infiltration logs, tile maintenance records, and yield maps, then laid them in sequence on the kitchen table beside Dana's stress tests and the Meridian letter. Outside, the old Ford sat under dust, rust still flaking off the rocker panels, looking exactly like the wrong vehicle for a man making million-dollar land decisions. Inside, the arithmetic was waiting for anyone willing to read it. Outside, the old Ford sat under dust, rust still flaking off the rocker panel, looking exactly like the wrong vehicle for a man making million-dollar land decisions. Inside, the arithmetic was waiting for anyone willing to read it. On the morning of the field review, county staff, 2 extension agronomists, Dana Rusk and Travis Keene, stood at the edge of Earl's roadside tract, while a drone map glowed on a tablet in the shade of a seed tender. Travis repeated the phrase marginal ground twice, leaning on traffic counts and future rooftops, and the lead agronomist answered with soil class overlays and infiltration logs stamped across 12 growing seasons. Organic matter had climbed from 2.1% to 4.3%. Phosphorus held near 38 parts per million. Potassium held near 182. No-till and cover crops had preserved structure through compaction years, and drainage maintenance had kept the profile open enough that drought stress expressed later and less severely. The projected corn yield on Earl's inspected blocks was still near 171 bushels per acre in a dry July, while adjacent, conventionally worked tracts sampled near 129. Nobody raised their voice. The data did the arguing. At the rezoning hearing 3 evenings later, Travis arrived with rendered street grids, traffic flow models, and a fiscal impact slide that treated farm income as static and residential tax base as destiny. He spoke for 19 minutes. Earl spoke for 52 seconds. He said the land was not sentimental inventory. It was a productive asset with measured outputs, and no offer disconnected from lifetime productivity could be called fair. Then Dana requested permission to file 2 documents into the public record: a conservation easement on 140 of the 200 acres, recorded that afternoon, and a certified proof of funds letter tied to an 80-acre estate purchase that had closed at 10:14 that same morning for $612,000 cash, eliminating Meridian's corridor continuity. The room shifted from speculation to verification in less than 1 minute. The board chair asked for the financial basis behind that move, and Dana read from Earl's sworn statement, line by line, with the same cadence she used in tax meetings. Owned acreage after the morning close, 720 acres. Conservative market value at $13,000 per acre, $9,360,000. Liquid reserves across insured cash and short-term instruments, $2,140,000. Equipment book value on fully owned machinery, $418,000. Long-term debt, $0. Estimated net worth, $11,918,000. Travis looked toward the back of the room where the old Ford was visible through the lobby glass, then back to the table, as if the truck should file an objection. A board member who had once called Earl's place retirement money territory leaned forward and asked Dana whether those figures had encumbrances hidden in operating notes. She answered with one sentence: no term lines, no variable rate obligations, and no personal guarantees outstanding. The vote came 6-1 against rezoning. What followed mattered more than the vote itself. Vindication was the easy part. Distribution was harder. Earl walked out without looking for Travis, drove home in the same patched coat, and by 10 that night he had opened the segregated reserve account he had planned in draft for weeks. $300,000 designated for zero-interest operating support, quarterly budget reporting required, variable rate debt prohibited by covenant. 4 days passed before the first kitchen table meeting began. Ben Harlan arrived with a banker's packet, 3 months of overdue machinery projections, and the kind of exhaustion that comes from doing math after midnight for too many nights in a row. Earl and Dana had already reconstructed the stack. Combine and planter obligations were crushing monthly cash flow at $6,920 before insurance and service contracts. Earl offered a restructure that protected Ben's remaining core acres instead of preserving appearances. He issued $120,000 at zero interest over 5 years, first 6 months payment-free, then $2,000 monthly, with one condition that mattered more than the rate. Ben had to sell one underutilized header, drop the service contract, and lock future notes to fixed terms only. Ben signed with both hands flat on the table and cried once, quietly, when Dana showed him the revised annual burden dropping by more than $34,000. By harvest, he still farmed 190 acres, debt-controlled, and he paid the first scheduled installment on time. Rosa and Miguel Velez came 2 evenings later, with bankruptcy papers folded inside a feed invoice envelope. Their barns were operationally sound, but the note reset had turned a working model into a cash drain. Earl offered a $90,000 feed bridge at 0 interest for 30 months. Tied to a lender renegotiation clause, Dana drafted that required conversion from variable to fixed terms before any second disbursement. He also paid $6,800 directly to an accounting firm to prepare the restructuring package the bank had delayed for months. Rosa resisted taking help for nearly an hour, repeating that they had made their own decisions and needed to carry their own consequences. Earl answered in 9 words. Carry them, yes. Carry them alone, no. They accepted. 37 days later, their lender executed revised fixed terms, and both barns stayed in production. Nathan Pike did not ask for money. He asked for access. His daughter, Ellie Pike, 26, had livestock experience and no affordable ground left near home after the auction. Earl leased her 80 acres from the tract he had just secured at $185 per acre against the local market near $285, with a 5-year step schedule and a soil stewardship clause requiring cover on all erodible acres. Annual rent relief came to about $8,000 compared with prevailing terms, but the larger gift was stability. Ellie could plan 5 seasons ahead, not one anxious spring at a time. Earl also fronted $12,400 for tile repairs and deducted none of it from year 1 rent, because drainage failure would have punished her cash flow before she ever got traction. Nathan took a mechanic's shift in Clay County and spent Saturdays helping Ellie fence and seed hay strips. The land stayed in the family orbit, not by nostalgia, by structure. The pattern across those meetings was becoming unmistakable when Deshaun Miller arrived last, not with distress papers, but with a plan. He had assembled lease commitments for pasture and had labor capacity for 60 cows, but equipment entry cost blocked launch. Earl converted what could have been another loan into a conditional grant, $75,000 for essential equipment and handling infrastructure, released in tranches against receipts with 2 obligations attached. Deshaun had to submit quarterly budgets to Dana for 2 years, and when cash flow turned positive, he had to mentor one beginning operator at no charge for a full season. The first tranche covered a used feed mixer, fencing supplies, a squeeze chute, and a reliable pickup with no note attached. By the end of his second year, Deshaun's operation reached positive cash flow, and he had already started helping a younger neighbor build a grazing plan that reduced purchased feed exposure. At the elevator, Earl never framed the choice as philosophy. He answered it with paperwork. Every support agreement he issued included the same 1-page covenant: no variable rate operating debt without written review, quarterly cash flow updates, and transparent cost per acre or cost per head tracking. Pride had nearly sunk half the county. Process gave people a way back. By the 3rd week of August, Dana completed the deeper examination file the board had requested for policy review, and it became the clearest proof in the whole county that Earl's philosophy was not folklore. She ran 2 15-year scenarios on the disputed 200 acres. Sell scenario: gross sale price $2 million, estimated transaction and tax drag $380,000. Net investable principal, $1,620,000. Assumed annual return, 5.2%. Future value after 15 years, approximately $3,464,000 before inflation. Hold scenario. Annual net operating income, $184,000 on conservative pricing. Reinvestment at 5.2%. Future value of the income stream alone, approximately $4,110,000 over 15 years. Plus retained land value and probable appreciation on Class 1 and Class 2 soils. The decision gap was not emotional. It was mathematical, and it widened in every model except the ones that assumed farming stopped working permanently. Dana then appended a year-by-year ledger sequence from the core accumulation era because broad claims collapse without chronology. 1988, 40 acres purchased for $48,000 cash. 1996, 60 acres for $72,600 cash. 2003, 80 acres for $132,000 cash. 2009, 120 acres. Sheriff sale at $294,000 cash. 2011, 70 acres for $238,000 cash. 2014, 90 acres for $441,000 cash. 2017, 110 acres for $792,000 cash. 2025, 80 acres, estate close at $612,000 cash. Cash purchase tranches totaled 650 acres for $2,629,600, or roughly $4,046 per acre average basis, over decades now pricing near $13,000 per acre. She then reconciled the ownership ledger directly. An additional 70 acres entered Earl's balance sheet through a documented family transfer in 1992, bringing owned acreage to 640 by 2024, then to 720 after the 2025 estate close. She paired that with machinery discipline. Major planter choice in 2016 saved about $20,000 in year one and near $140,000 over 7 years versus financed new. Repeated equipment decisions of that type preserved working capital that later became opportunity capital. The recipient trajectories went into the same file because generosity without outcomes is just story. Ben's restructure lowered fixed annual burden by over $34,000 and stabilized his 190-acre core. Rosa and Miguel's bridge plus renegotiation preserved 2 barns and prevented liquidation. Ellie Pike's below-market lease restored family land access and protected young operator cash flow during startup years. Deshawn's $75,000 grant launched a 60-cow unit that reached positive cash flow in year 2 and created 1 new mentorship seat by covenant. Combined direct commitments in that first round totaled $297,400 when support services were included, almost the full segregated reserve. Estimated first-order economic preservation across those operations exceeded $1,900,000 in retained productive assets within 18 months. The multiplier was already visible. Travis's outcome arrived in a 1-line letter postmarked 6 months later, addressed to Earl Coleman. No return flourish, no argument left. That soil test was the most expensive document I ever underestimated. Meridian reassigned him after 2 failed rural acquisitions, and county officials quietly tightened evidentiary standards for future rezoning claims involving agricultural productivity classes. Earl filed the letter in a plain folder behind the conservation easement copy and went back to routine. At dawn, the old Ford still rattled. At noon, the patched coat still carried grease at one cuff. At night, The ledger still opened under the same kitchen light, now with one additional line written at the bottom of a fresh page. Coleman Soil Stewardship Fund, planned capitalization, $2,500,000, annual no-interest lending tied to conservation metrics, so the arithmetic could keep working when he no longer had to. Dinah looked at that new line, asked one clarifying question about governance, and opened her laptop again before the coffee cooled. Earl wanted the fund documents drafted with the same blunt structure as his operating covenants. No ceremonial language, no glossy mission statement. Capitalization would be phased, not pledged loosely. $600,000 deposited on formation, $400,000 after the next tax year close, then annual contributions until the balance reached $2,500,000. Lending terms would remain zero interest, capped exposure, per borrower at $150,000, with mandatory quarterly reporting, and a conservation scorecard tied to residue cover, infiltration improvement, and erosion control. If a recipient missed reporting twice, disbursements paused. If a recipient shifted into variable rate debt without disclosure, the loan converted to market rate for the remainder of term. Mercy sat beside discipline, not in place of it. By mid-September 2025, the first outcomes had moved from projections to statements that cleared. Ben Harlan sold the underutilized header for $41,300, terminated the service contract with a negotiated buyout of $6,200, and applied the net directly against principal pressure. With Earl's $120,000 zero-interest restructure absorbing the immediate squeeze, Ben's annual fixed machinery burden dropped from roughly $95,000 to about $60,400, and his monthly cash calendar stopped breaking in June. He shifted 40 acres from corn to soybeans to reduce nitrogen exposure in a high-price fertilizer window, then posted a harvest that was not spectacular, but stable. At year-end, his operating margin turned positive by $27,800. More important, his lender did not control his spring planting decision anymore. Ben still worked long days, still drove an older truck, and still flinched at rain misses, but he was farming from a plan again. Rosa and Miguel Velez used the $90,000 feed bridge exactly as structured, and that precision mattered. First tranche covered feed commitments for 6 weeks. Second tranche triggered only after their bank signed fixed terms at 6.2%, with a longer amortization window. Dana's restructuring packet turned what had looked like terminal cash bleed into survivable monthly flow. Utilities were audited, ventilation controls were recalibrated, feed conversion monitoring tightened. By the second quarter after renegotiation, both barns were still operating, not at comfort margins, but above break-even, and the bankruptcy filing was converted into a managed reorganization pathway instead of liquidation. Rosa began sending quarterly reports with handwritten notes in the margins, always ending with the same line: numbers first, fear second. Ellie Pike's lease transformed more than one balance sheet. On 80 acres at $185 per acre. With a 5-year schedule she could trust, she built a forage and rotational grazing program that lowered purchased feed and stabilized winter planning. Earl's $12,400 tile support kept the first spring from becoming a mud season loss. Nathan Pike, after full shifts in Clay County, spent weekends repairing fence corners and calibrating a used drill she bought with cash and a small family loan. Their first-year net was modest, but positive. Year 2 showed a cleaner jump because fixed access costs stayed predictable. The land that had left their title re-entered their future, through tenancy that could become ownership if discipline held. Nathan called it breathing room. Ellie called it a runway. Deshaun Miller treated the $75,000 conditional grant like he was answering to a lender and a mentor at once. Receipts were organized by category. Capital purchases stayed inside scope. A used feed mixer at $18,600, squeeze chute and alley upgrades at $14,200, perimeter and cross fencing at $21,400, waterline improvements at $8,900, and a paid-for pickup at $9,800 left a contingency balance that he did not rush to spend. He reached positive cash flow in year 2 as projected, then fulfilled the covenant he had accepted. 1 full season of no-fee mentorship for a beginning operator. That operator, Kara Whitfield, leased 35 acres of rougher pasture nobody had valued properly. And with Deshaun's grazing plan, she cut supplemental feed costs by nearly 1/3 in her first cycle. 1 grant created 1 stable operation, then 1 mentor seat, then 1 more viable entry point. By January 2026, Dana's aggregate review gave the multiplier plain shape. Direct aid and associated support from Earl's first reserve round totaled $304,200 once legal and accounting interventions were included. Preserved productive capacity across recipient operations, measured through retained acreage, prevented liquidation value loss, and sustained livestock throughput, was estimated at $2,460,000 over 24 months. If those operations held current discipline for 5 years, projected cumulative retained equity and avoided distress costs approached $4,900,000. Earl read the report, asked 2 questions about assumptions, then approved moving the reserve back to full $300,000 capacity after repayments replenished it. Generosity was not a gesture in his model. It was a managed asset class with human purpose. Travis Keene's resolution unfolded without spectacle. Meridian had already reassigned him after the failed corridor strategy, and the reassignment became a demotion in all but title by spring 2026. 2 more rural targets collapsed under stricter evidentiary review after county staff began requiring productivity class documentation and verified water management records before advancing rezoning recommendations. Travis had been trained to sell urgency and upside renderings. He had not been trained to defeat 12 years of soil chemistry, yield maps, and owner liquidity. He did not go bankrupt. He did not disappear. He left Meridian 18 months after the board vote and joined a smaller site advisory firm in Indianapolis that specialized in redevelopment on already disturbed parcels where agricultural displacement risk was low and permitting timelines were cleaner. He sent 1 more letter to Earl, longer than the first and still direct. He wrote that he had spent most of his career discounting what he could not package into slide decks, and that the Terre Haute file had forced him to relearn valuation from the ground up. He enclosed, almost awkwardly, a printed policy memo his new firm circulated internally: no rural acquisition recommendation without independent soil productivity analysis and long-horizon farm income comparison against one-time sale proceeds after tax drag. Earl filed that second letter in the same folder as the first, behind the easement and ahead of Dana's model sheets. No reply was mailed. None was needed. Travis had his own form of correction, and it was specific. By the second week of March 2026, the roll call around Earl's orbit had become the truest measure of the whole story. Lila Morton still came 3 months each winter, still used the same yellow legal pads, and now supervised fund compliance tracking with Dana. So borrower reports were standardized and early warnings were visible before crises. Dana Rusk remained Earl's accountant and became founding administrator for the Coleman Soil Stewardship Fund under a modest paid contract she had resisted until Earl insisted that unpaid governance fails eventually. Ben Harlan was farming 190 acres with controlled obligations and had not missed a single scheduled payment to the reserve note. Rosa and Miguel Velez were operating both barns under fixed terms, lean but intact, and had hired one part-time local worker back after 2 years of doing every shift themselves. Nathan Pike kept his mechanic's job and looked less tired in church because Ellie's lease had stabilized the family's weekends. Ellie Pike expanded forage sales on the side and set aside her first dedicated land purchase account with an opening deposit of $6,000. Deshaun Miller's 60-cow unit stayed cash flow positive, and Kara Whitfield's small pasture operation entered its second year with better body condition scores and lower purchased feed per head. Caleb Dunn, who had exited row crops, built a steady custom application business and finally cleared the loss carryover that had shadowed him since the fertilizer spike year. He told neighbors he slept better owning less and billing for work he could price clearly. Glenn Carver, whose auction had shaped Earl's earliest rule, had passed away years earlier, but his widow attended a conservation meeting in 2026 where Dana presented the fund framework. Afterward, she told Earl quietly that Glenn would have approved of lending that required discipline and left dignity intact. The line landed and stayed with him, and Earl himself changed least in ways people could see. The 1997 Ford still started hard on cold mornings and still wore rust on the rocker panels. The patched coat still hung by the same mudroom door. The farmhouse roof still held because he continued repairing instead of replacing when repair math won. On paper, he was explicit wealth, 720 owned acres, strong liquidity, fully owned equipment, no long-term debt. In motion, he was routine. He planted when windows opened, sold grain in tranches, reviewed covenants, checked tile outlets after heavy rain, and opened the ledger under the same kitchen light. One of his older machines, the grain cart he rebuilt for $412 in bearings and seals, kept running through another full season, which was exactly the point he had made to Deshaun in the shed. Preserve cash in panic years, so purpose has fuel later. The fund reached formal launch by summer 2026 with $1 million already deposited and the remaining capitalization schedule locked in writing. The first annual lending cycle approved 4 loans and 1 grant conversion, all tied to conservation metrics and fixed-rate discipline. County officials began citing the framework in extension workshops, not as charity theater, but as a practical risk management model for operators who wanted to survive volatility without surrendering control. Earl never gave a long speech about it. At one meeting, he stood, adjusted his cap, and said 40 words. If you borrow short and float the rate, weather will eventually pick your banker. If you stay liquid and protect soil, weather is still hard, but you keep choices. Then he sat down. By October, after a drier finish than anyone wanted, the contrast that had opened this story remained visible in one parking lot. New trucks lined the front row at the elevator. Earl parked farther back in faded paint and rust. A young clerk who knew the files now treated him with the same calm respect he gave larger branded operations, and that was progress of a quiet kind. Appearance still suggested one thing. Records said another. The farmer who looked poorest had built one of the strongest balance sheets in the county, then used it to keep other families in production. Near dusk that same week, Earl drove home along the roadside parcel that had once carried a $2 million offer and now carried winter cover, establishing green across dark soil. He pulled over, stepped out, and crumbled a handful of earth between both palms, testing moisture by feel the way he always had, then brushed his hands, got back in the rattling Ford, and drove toward the patched roof house where the ledger waited open to a clean page. He wrote 5 names down the left margin before he wrote a single dollar amount. Ben Harlan, Rosa Velas, and Miguel Velas, Ellie Pike, Deshaun Miller, Cara Whitfield. Then he added a 6th line, left blank for whoever came next, and slid the soil test folder beside the ledger so both would stay in view under the kitchen light. At 7 the next morning, Dana arrived with 2 banker boxes and Lila behind her, carrying cinnamon rolls in a dented pan. They spread documents across the same scarred table that had held the Meridian scenario page. Repayment schedules, quarterly reports, feed conversion sheets, pasture maps, and 1 envelope from county staff confirming the policy change Earl had pushed without speeches. Any rezoning request touching Class 1 or Class 2 soils now required independent productivity analysis, 5-year yield history, and water management records certified by extension. The report had become rule. By the first week of December 2026, the first full cycle outcome sat in front of all 3 of them, and the numbers carried faces. Ben came in first, cap in both hands, boots still dusted from hauling corn. He set down his ledger copy and waited until Dana nodded. Net operating margin for the year, $46,120. 0 missed reserve payments, machinery burden held at $60,400 annual, down from the old pressure load, near $95,000. He had rebuilt 1 older grain head with used parts for $8,700 instead of financing a replacement, near $68,000, and that single decision preserved enough cash to prepay seed at a seasonal discount worth $3,140. He asked 1 question before leaving. If Caleb wants my old guidance monitor cheap, that allowed? Earl answered in 5 words. If it keeps him working, yes. Rosa and Miguel arrived together after lunch and set down a folder with tabs in Rosa's handwriting. Both barns remained open. Fixed, renegotiated terms had held. Their monthly debt service was still heavy, $10,180, but no longer jumping under them. Feedbridge balance remaining was $38,000 on schedule. They had added 1 part-time worker back, 22 hours a week, and paid him on time for 8 straight months. Miguel pointed to a line item and almost laughed from relief. Emergency feed purchases, down 19% after ration planning tightened. Rosa looked at Earl for a long second before speaking. I did not trust help. I trust math now. Ellie Pike came at dusk with Nathan and a coffee can full of receipts she had already copied twice. Her 80-acre lease had stayed intact under the conservation covenant, and forage sales had pushed her year-end net to $31,900 after rent, seed, repairs, and fuel. She had opened a land account at $6,000 and grown it to $18,400. Nathan, still working mechanics in Clay County, had paid down his own small personal note to under $4,000 and said he had not missed a Sunday meal with his daughter in 6 months. Earl opened a folder, slid out an option agreement, and pushed it across the table. Right of first refusal on that same 80 acres if he or his estate ever sold, with a pricing formula tied to independent appraisal minus documented soil improvements she funded. Ellie did not cry. She read every line, signed the acknowledgement copy, and whispered, "Now I can build long." 3 days later, Deshaun arrived with Cara and a younger man none of them knew yet, Thomas Reed, 21, leased ground, no equipment note, good records. Deshawn's 60-cow operation posted second-year positive cash flow at $54,300. Kara's 35-acre pasture cycle cut purchased feed by 32% and moved from marginal to viable. She had begun mentoring Tomas under the same no-fee condition Deshawn had completed, and Tomas had already built a first-year budget with a projected debt service ratio under 0.25. Earl asked only for quarterly reporting and fixed-rate discipline if any borrowing entered the plan. Tomas agreed before the coffee cooled. That winter review produced the multiplier Dana had predicted, and nobody else believed at first. First-round direct support and attached services, now fully reconciled, totaled $304,200. Preserved productive capacity across recipient operations over 24 months reached $2,460,000. With the new second-generation mentorship chain from Deshawn to Kara to Tomas, projected 5-year retained equity and avoided distress losses moved above $5,300,000. One reserve account had turned into a local stability engine. By late January 2027, the physical record trail was closed cleanly, item by item. The original 12-year soil folder was scanned and duplicated. One copy stayed in the kitchen file cabinet. One went into the Coleman Soil Stewardship Fund archive, and one was deposited with extension for producer training. The two Travis letters, the conservation easement, the Meridian scenario page, and Dana's deeper examination report were indexed in a single red binder labeled Terre Haute Case, checked out twice that year by county planners and returned with signatures. Nothing stayed loose in drawers anymore. Evidence had become infrastructure. Travis Keene's final resolution arrived in person, not by mail, on a rainy Tuesday in March. He parked a plain, mid-sized truck this time, no dealership shine, and stood in Earl's mudroom holding a folder stamped with his new firm's mark. He had left Meridian, as expected, and now worked redevelopment sites inside existing utility corridors around Indianapolis. He asked if he could use Earl's case in internal training for junior analysts. Earl said yes if every slide started with soil class, net operating income, and after-tax comparison, not renderings. Travis agreed. Then he admitted what the loaded look at the elevator had meant the first day. He had seen the rust and assumed desperation. "I thought you needed my exit," he said. "You already had your plan." He left with no dramatic handshake, only a copy of the red binder index and a note Dana required him to sign acknowledging source accuracy. The roll call by spring 2027 settled into ordinary, which was the best outcome any of them could have asked for. Lila kept winter books and trained a part-time assistant, so compliance work would outlive her own schedule. Dana administered the fund under a formal contract, published annual metrics, and refused 3 applications that failed reporting standards, proving the covenant had teeth. Ben remained on 190 acres, paid down the zero-interest restructure to $72,000, and started mentoring one high school graduate through machinery budgeting. Rosa and Miguel held both barns, rebuilt cash reserves to $64,000, and took 1 weekend off each month for the first time in years. Nathan kept his job and his weekends on Ellie's place. Ellie expanded forage acreage, hit $27,000 in her land account, and filed her first independent tax return with positive retained earnings. Deshawn stayed profitable and documented every mentor hour. Kara entered year 3 with improved herd condition and no delinquent payables. Tomas signed his first 3-year lease with a fixed rent escalator he could model before planting. Caleb Dunn's custom application business cleared enough margin to replace one sprayer pump with cash, no note. The younger merchandiser, who once used the slow voice at the elevator, now taught risk workshops and opened with Earl's cost-per-acre sheets, publicly admitting he had misread discipline as decline. The county board member, who had called the offer retirement money, voted for the Productivity Evidence Ordinance and later told a crowd he had learned the difference between valuation and price. Glenn Carver's widow passed away peacefully in May 2027. At her request, memorial gifts went to the fund. Earl attended, stood in the back, and said little. 2 weeks later, the fund committee approved its first memorial-designated, no-interest loan in Glenn's name, $40,000 to a young couple, replacing flood-damaged fencing on owned ground they had nearly listed for sale. By the second week of October 2027, the Coleman Soil Stewardship Fund reached full planned capitalization at $2,500,000. Annual lending capacity, capped conservatively at 18% deployment, stood at $450,000, with reserve buffers intact. Default rate remained 0%. Reporting compliance sat at 96%. Conservation scores trended upward across enrolled acres, and infiltration improvements were documented field by field. Earl still wore the same patched coat. The Ford still rattled into the elevator lot and still parked farther back. On paper, he was an operator with land near $9,360,000, liquidity that moved with cycles, owned equipment, no long-term debt, and a community balance sheet that had started borrowing his discipline as much as his dollars. If you have followed this story to this point, subscribe for the next one where numbers, not appearances, decide who keeps the farm. Comment with the one rule you would put in writing before issuing any zero-interest loan. Share this with one person who thinks wealth has to look expensive to be real. Near dusk, after finishing tile checks on the roadside parcel that had once carried a $2 million offer, Earl stopped by the same field edge where he had stood before. Cover crop roots held firm in the dark soil. Water from a light rain moved down instead of running off. He scooped a handful, pressed it once, and let it break apart through his fingers. Then he brushed his palms, climbed back into the rusted truck, and drove home to the patched roof house where the ledger waited open, one clean page at a time.